Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Emma.
I'm Zara.
Well, the US election has finally arrived.
Finally.
Sort of. By the time most Aussies go to bed tonight, voting will have opened in most American states. And by the time most of us finish work tomorrow, polls in all 50 states will have closed and counting will have begun to determine who will be the next president of the United States. Kamala Harris or Donald Trump?
Without further ado, Em, what is our first deep dive today about?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about the magnitude of this election campaign, how much it's dominated global headlines and how long it's dominated headlines for. But if you're sick of hearing about it or wondering if it even matters to us here in Australia, I can completely understand why. But from, trade to defence, the economy, culture, diplomacy, foreign aid, a Trump presidency and a Harris presidency could look really different for us here in Australia and around the world. So to explain what this election could mean for Australians, I've managed to pin down one of the busiest people in Australian media this week, host of the ABC's Planet America, Chaz Licciardello. Chaz is a self-identifying Yankophile, which feels like an understatement. He is the authority, an absolute expert in all things American politics. And he is joining us today to talk through this idea of why the election matters to Australians and what a Harris v. Trump presidency could look like for us here. Here's my chat with Chaz. Chaz, welcome to the podcast. Election week is finally here. We have been paying very close attention to what is only being described as a race that is getting tighter. Before we dive in, though, today, what's the latest on the poll front? What's the crystal ball say this week?
It is genuinely 50-50. Like the pollcasters who I pay most attention to, the aggregators like the Cook Political Report, 538, they are literally saying 51% chance of Trump winning. 51% chance. It's as close to a 50-50 as you can possibly get. So The analogy I've been drawing all week, and I'll draw it with you as well. If you've heard me draw it somewhere else, I'm sorry, but it's just true, is every single thing you hear from a so-called expert, including what I'm about to tell you, is the top of the iceberg. Below the water, we don't know what is there. There could be 3 points of error below the water. We just don't know. And there are 7 states that can go either way, which doesn't mean it's going to take 3 weeks of counting. It doesn't mean that it's going to be an actual 50-50 result. It just means anything is possible. That's what it means.
Well, as the pollsters and the experts continue to hypothesize, obviously, this is a campaign that has dominated global headlines, and that tells us a lot about America's global influence. But there might be Aussies, young Aussies in particular, who are frankly sick of hearing about it. So what I really wanted to chat to you about a little bit today was more on, why they should care, if they should care. So can we start on the Australia-US relationship? In what ways are we important to each other?
Well, there are some direct ways, some direct obvious ways, like, for instance, defense agreements that we have in place with America, where America stops us being invaded by other countries. And America has a whole bunch of bases on our land. And we have agreements to build submarines together. And that submarine agreement, by the way, which is a big agreement for us, for Australia, that's not necessarily locked down. Depending on if Trump becomes president again, he might just tear that up. There has been talk of it being torn up. So that is one area where there's a direct relationship. But also on top of that, another area where what happens matters to us is that with the president, there's some things they say they can do that really they can't do. And then there's things they say they can do, which they can absolutely do and no one can stop them. One of those things that no one can stop are tariffs. Trump is obsessed with tariffs and he can do them by himself. He can lay tariffs down as much as he likes, according to American law. So Congress can't stop him. What that means is Australia, we export a lot to America and we also export to a lot of other countries that also trade with America. So if Trump cuts off America from the rest of the world as far as trading goes, that creates a lot of potential opportunities for Australia with those other countries. Trading opportunities with, say, China and with Asia, with Japan, countries like that. There's also the opportunities we have with America. Like Trump has notoriously fought with a bunch of other countries in the past, and I expect this term wouldn't be any different. But if you get on his good side, there's opportunities there in store for you as well. So maybe if right now we've got a Labor government, which probably won't help with Trump, but if Australia can get on his good side and can suck up to him just the right way, that could potentially provide opportunities for Australia as well. So at least in a financial sense, you might say Trump being president could be better for Australia than Harris being president. But then there's another side to this as well. The side is, how do you feel about Taiwan getting invaded by China? Because I reckon Trump could potentially not fight that as hard as Harris could. I mean, you just need to see how he's reacted to Ukraine. Taiwan might be Ukraine Part 2, for all we know. China seems to be interpreting Taiwan as Ukraine Part 2. So if Trump is in power, that might lead to potentially a conflagration in Taiwan that we could either get sucked into or be affected by in some way. So there's a lot of reasons why Australia should care directly about America other than just enjoying the reality TV nature of it.
The circus, the greatest show on earth. Yeah. So some kind of global diplomacy question marks there, economic uncertainty. Of course, we're in a unique situation here where Trump, we know what a presidency under Donald Trump has looked like. So in terms of the implications for Australia, are there any lessons there from his 4 years of leadership that have come and gone?
It's interesting. There are certainly lessons that people have acted like they've learnt, but I'm not sure they're as clear cut as people suggest. Like, for instance, what I just said to you now, suck up to Donald Trump and there's some opportunities therein for you. That is a lesson that I think a lot of people have learnt, but maybe that's not the lesson, because Malcolm Turnbull famously didn't suck up to Donald Trump. He stood up to Donald Trump and he got in his face and it kind of worked for him. So I think the bottom line with Donald Trump, it's about personal diplomacy. I don't think there is a strict rule of thumb exactly how you deal with him. I just think he responds well to some people and not so well to others. And it's just a case of how well the Australian Prime Minister can suss him out. Like, I don't know if Anthony Albanese has the right stuff to suss him out. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he'd be Turnbull Mark II. He'd be excellent at it. I don't really know.
If we imagine a Kamala Harris presidency, can you foreshadow any immediate significant changes for the Australian people?
No, not really. And like Kamala Harris seems to be, not only are a lot of her policies continuing what the Biden administration was already doing, but I think by her nature, she seems to be quite cautious, not just during this election campaign, but I've been following her for 8 years, and the whole time she's always been nervous about making mistakes. She tries to avoid mistakes as much as she possibly can. So she takes her time to make decisions, and she makes them carefully, and she doesn't make big decisions. She likes to nibble a bit at a time. So I don't think there'd be any drastic changes immediately with Kamala Harris. And any change that did occur, I think would be signalled pretty heavily well in advance, so we'd have time to work it out.
Let's zoom out globally. You've touched a little bit on global conflict, Ukraine. What would a Harris presidency and a Trump presidency look like for funding and aid for global conflicts? So the Middle East and Russia and Ukraine.
Okay, well, let's start with the easy one, which is Trump and Ukraine. Funding ends tomorrow. If Trump is president, funding for Ukraine ends tomorrow. Like, he has shown no interest whatsoever in perpetuating that battle or that war in any way, shape or form. He very much talks about ending the war in one day through negotiation. And like, what that means making some kind of deal, striking some kind of deal that Putin would accept. because Zelensky is not the person who can dictate his terms in this war at this point in time. Putin's the one who can dictate his terms if you want to end it tomorrow. So I would say funding would end, and I would say the war would end on unsatisfactory terms for people who are on Ukraine's side, I would suggest, for Ukraine. Kamala Harris, I think things would continue on as they are with Ukraine. I don't think there'd be any difference. Now, as far as Israel goes, Kamala Harris has definitely tried to occupy a position slightly less slavishly pro-Israel than America has been in the past, but she hasn't gone all the way to pro-Palestinian. She's just been more likely to criticize Israel when they're skimping on aid, for instance, or when they're getting in the way of other people providing aid, or when it seems like they're being overly aggressive in their attacks in a way that would impact on the Palestinian civilians. She's been much more forward in criticizing Israel than Biden has. But tactically, I'm not sure she's all that different. So I'm not sure that would change too much if she became president. Now, Trump, things could change a bit there as well. Trump's attitude to Israel is just get it done with. Just end this as fast as possible. You break all the bottles that you need to do. You drop all the bombs you need to do. Just get it finished fast. That's pretty much his attitude. And so I suspect that Netanyahu would take advantage of that to escalate in the short term the conflict, particularly with Hezbollah and with Hamas. I'm not sure he'd necessarily rubber stamp an Iran war, but I suspect there'd be a lot of bombing going on in Beirut and in Gaza pretty quickly if Trump took over, with a view to hopefully ending the conflict faster as well. But in the meantime, I don't think people who are concerned about what's happening in Gaza at the moment would enjoy the next few months if Trump took over.
What would that look like for US allies? I'm thinking of not just Australia, but other global Western powers. If suddenly, literally overnight, the approach from the US to these major global conflicts shifted, how does that implicate those relationships between the allies?
I don't think what would happen in Israel or Ukraine would necessarily change that a lot, because I think it's not a surprise. Trump has been signaling for a long time what he's going to be doing. Everyone would be expecting it. I think the issue with our other allies is how Trump approaches alliances like NATO. In the past, he has been, some would say, obsessed with the percentage of GDP that each country is spending on defense. Because under NATO, there's kind of a gentleman's agreement that you're supposed to spend 2% of your GDP on defense. And Trump treated that like it was some kind of duty that you were paying, some kind of toll. But I think that if Trump is comfortable with where the other countries are in NATO and can stop rocking the boat, then there wouldn't necessarily be a big change in the relationship between America and European countries. And we're mostly talking about European countries here. But if he gets a bee in his bonnet about NATO, I think that at this point in time, I think there'll be a few European countries that would start to say, I'm not sure we can rely on these guys anymore. It might be time for Europe to start building our own defense capacity away from America. It might be time for Europe to get its own nuclear program away from America. And it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
We've touched on the more political side of the potential impacts, but culturally, the US is an epicenter of culture. It sets the agenda for the rest of us. With the impending violence that people are predicting, that, 2/3 of Americans said that they're expecting violence after the election. So that is something that they seem to be able to agree on. What kind of tone does that set in terms of democratic process? If we see that happen a second time, how are you feeling about that side of things?
Yeah, look, I think you make a really good point in your question about the fact, is it different when you see it a second time? Does it start becoming commonplace? And I must say, I have one of the concerns I have about this era of politics, and I'm not just referring to Trump here, but Trump has obviously been driving this era, is that we're now in 2024. People who came of political consciousness after 2014, that's 10 years now. So there are people who, let's say kids start to become politically aware at, say, 16, 17. There are people now who are 26 who know nothing but this era and who know nothing but civil unrest and Twitter spats and adults acting like kids and constant brinksmanship and partisanship and hatred and the emergence of Nazis and this has been a bad 10 years as far as social harmony goes. And this is all they know. And if this continues for another 4 years, whether it's Harris or Trump as president, then you're talking about 30-year-olds who this is all they know. And that worries me. That worries me because if this is all you know, then you are doomed to recreate it yourself when you are in charge. And we're getting to the point where some of these people are old enough to be in charge themselves. That is concerning. If we do have another election post-period like we had last time, I would be concerned that this was starting to become democracy as practiced by America, and it would continue on. So I really hope that's not the case. One thing I'm encouraged by is the fact we are all talking about it, I think helps head it off. I think violence is more likely to occur when it's a surprise, because when everyone's expecting it, there will be people trying to calm other people down, going, well, hang on, let's not get hasty here. And also, it's not just that, also with the Supreme Court, everyone is expecting the lawsuits. Everyone is expecting a rehash of what happened on January 6th when there was some scheme to try and work around the rules. Everyone's expecting all of that, and they're going to be looking out for it. There'll be lawyers everywhere. On election day, they're going to be drowning in lawyers on election day and in that period afterwards. And that's kind of like, I would compare it to the situation in the 60s with nuclear war between Russia and America, where they were both armed to the teeth and they both knew what the other side would do. And so they were trying to avoid pulling the trigger. It was called, mutually assured destruction. There's kind of mutually assured destruction in the legal situation in American politics at the moment, with the lawyers everywhere from either side scrutinizing each other. And my hope is that keeps everyone in check. That's my hope. But we'll see.
I think it's interesting, even, here in Australia, regardless of your political identity, there does seem to be a renewed sentiment of gratefulness, like, oh, we're lucky that that's not what it's like here, or, we might have a lot of infighting in politics down in Canberra, but at the end of the day, people seem to have a little bit more gratitude for the peacefulness here.
We should be grateful. We really should. I've always been a bit of a Yankophile. I do love America a lot. Having this job has led me to appreciate Australia a lot more and appreciate the very simple little differences that end up having huge consequences. Like, for instance, compulsory voting is something that I used to be against. Like 15 years ago or 20 years ago, I was against compulsory voting. I thought it was horrible. I hated it. I hated being forced to get up and go down to a church. But but I've learned with American politics, it makes a big difference. Like, society functions much better with compulsory voting. The reason for that is because when there isn't compulsory voting, the sides are trying to drive out their base more than anything else. They have to convince them to vote, and that forces them to be more extreme. One of the reasons why America polarizes is because they are pitching to the extreme. Another thing about compulsory voting is it forces them to not be negative. Because in Australia, when someone runs too negative a campaign, the people who don't give a shit, who are in the middle and then they're disinterested and they don't care about politics at all, they get pissed off. In Australia, if you piss them off, they're going to vote. Whereas in America, if you piss them off, they might just stay home. I'm grateful that we've got an electoral commission that's independent and neutral. Whereas in America, the people running these elections are Democrats and Republicans. It's insane. There's a lot of things. I could go on like this forever, but we should be grateful that we live in Australia, and it's never going to be like America because of these structural differences.
Chaz, before we let you go, it would be remiss of me not to check in with you on some of the criminal proceedings against Donald Trump. This isn't a discussion that's been really in the spotlight so much the last few months, but what could a Trump presidency mean for those proceedings?
Sure. Okay, well, there are 4 cases that have been against Trump the whole time. The 2 federal cases there was a January 6th case, and there was also the case of the taking the documents, these private documents, these classified documents, and storing them in Mar-a-Lago. Now, the Mar-a-Lago case has been dismissed for now, but it will come back if it has the opportunity to come back. It won't come back if Trump is president. So that will be the end of it if Trump is president. Trump will also end the January 6th case if he is president. They're gone. Then there are 2 other cases. There's a January 6th case in Georgia, which has its own problems. I wouldn't be expecting that to be happening anytime in the next year or 2, but Trump can't stop that. That's going ahead. If that is wound down early, it will be because the prosecutor is so incompetent. It will have nothing to do with Trump. So that's that. The other one is the New York case where he's been found guilty already, and sentencing is coming down probably after the election, and Trump is not stopping that. He is getting sentenced. Now, you might go, does that mean he can be in jail while he's president? Theoretically, yes. But if he is actually jailed while he's president, what will happen is they'll appeal that to the Supreme Court, and they'll say this is infringing the constitutional duties of the president for him to be in jail, and they'll say, yes, we will put off your jail time until after you're no longer president. So I don't think he'll get sentenced to jail time anyway, to be honest. But whatever happens, he cannot stop that. That is going to happen. That sentencing will happen, and he will serve his time one way or another, regardless of whether he's president.
Is there any way a Harris presidency could expedite some of these proceedings, could ramp things up a little bit for him on the criminal front?
If Harris is president, it's the direct opposite. The 2 state proceedings I just described before, she can't affect. So they will continue on. As I just said, Trump will be sentenced on the New York trial, and the Georgia trial will be up to the competence of the prosecutor. But the other ones will be the problem for Trump. The ones that he would have dismissed, the 2 federal proceedings. The January 6th one will definitely be proceeding with, I think, quite a lot of vigor if Kamala Harris becomes the president. And I would expect a verdict in that trial probably very early next year, maybe February or March, I would say. And then depending on what happens, when he's found guilty, then a sentence. So that one is the one he'd be most worried about. Then there's the Mar-a-Lago case, which I do think, if Kamala Harris is president, will be revitalized. There's an easy way for them to do that legally, and I think they will. And I think that will also happen. I think in both those cases, if he's found guilty, he's going to jail. So I would say that, especially the Mar-a-Lago case, that's got jail time written all over it. That's got real jail time written all over it. So I would say if Kamala Harris becomes president, she's going to have a tough decision to make. And that decision is going to be, because she's probably not going to have the Senate, right? We're going to find out in the next day or 2, obviously. But I think the chances of the Democrats winning the Senate, or again, 50 seats in the Senate, and if Kamala Harris is president, then she will control the Senate, is below 10% according to the main poll aggregators. So it's very unlikely, right? If she doesn't have the Senate, she's going to have a choice to make. Do I stand in the way of Trump going to jail and then I can function with the Republican Senate? Or do I choose to allow these court cases to proceed and for him to go to jail, and the Republicans who hold the Senate stop me doing anything for the rest of my presidency? That's going to be a tough decision for her.
Wow.
Because if she chooses the easy option for her and she gets in the way of the prosecutions so that she can get along with the Republicans in the Senate, then the Democrats will probably spit the dummy, because the Democrats will go, hang on, this guy's never held accountable ever. The first time he might get held accountable, you, a Democrat, got in the way. What are you doing? So she's kind of damned if she does, damned if she doesn't. It's going to be a really tough situation for Kamala Harris if she wins the presidency and doesn't win the Senate. So that's something to look out for.
Wow. Chaz, I wonder if in 6 months' time I'll be chatting to you about the president who sent Donald Trump to jail.
You may well be. You may well be.
Time will tell. Now, I'm not going to ask you what your predictions are. I hope that you get some sleep this week, and we really, really appreciate your time today, Chaz. Where can our listeners look out for your analysis over the coming days?
We're going to be making a live show on 8 o'clock on News 24 on election night. So that's Wednesday in Australia. Wednesday, 8 p.m, News 24. They'll be repeated at 9:30 on ABC One, but you should watch it live. So that's the best place to go. And I'm going to have a podcast out next Friday, usual time, 8 o'clock on the 8 News channel on Friday. And I'll have a podcast out, a big podcast out, the Pet Podcast with me and Dr. Dave on Friday night as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chaz. Stay hydrated and we will chat to you soon.
Thank you so much.